world. Why do bad things happen? If God were good, wouldn't he want to stop the evil? If God were all powerful, then he should be able to stop the evil, right? But because there is evil in this world, and that's undeniable, there is evil in this world. God either must not be good or he must not be all powerful. But either way, the God of the Bible must not exist. But in our variation, this variation to the problem of evil, we find that as we go through life, there's just so much hevel. Can't make sense of it all. Everything seems so random, so what's the point? And the Kohelet essentially asks this question throughout chapters 1 and 2. What's the point of working so hard in this life? What difference do we really make in the grand scheme of things? Now remember, the Kohelet describes himself as a king. He's the highest authority in the land. He describes himself as being both wise and rich. He's the richest person that you've ever heard of. He had slaves and flocks and herds. He had silver and gold. He says he did great things. He built houses and gardens and parks and pools and forests. He gave himself everything that his heart desired as a reward for all of his hard work. Wine, women, merriment of every kind. And it didn't fulfill him, and he found it to be hevel. And he discovers that no matter how much he has, at some point, he is going to die. And he can't take everything that he has with him. And one day, everything that he has, everything that he's worked for, is going to go to someone who didn't work for it. So that takes us to chapter 3. Are there any questions before we get started? Any comments? Anything that jumped out to you? Okay. Well, I'll divide chapter 3 into two sections. The first section, verses 1 through 15, the Kohelet's teachings through a poem on time, the orderly design of God's creation. That there is wisdom in God's creation, but the problem is that we humans can't know what that wisdom is. And in the second section, verses 16 through 22, the Kohelet explores the concept and the idea of justice as compared to injustice. As we go through the text, if there's any questions, anything that pops into your head, please don't hesitate to reach out or speak up. So let's read the first section of the text, starting in chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Hey, Joe, do we got the slides? Yeah, we're good. There is an appointed time for everything. There is a time for every matter under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to search and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. You probably recognize these verses. They are the most famous verses in the book. There was a song written by Peter Seeger in 1959 that was originally called "To Everything There Is a Season." It was released in 1962 by a band I've never heard of. Didn't become popular until 1965 when the Byrds released their version called "Turn, Turn, Turn." And the lyrics are taken almost verbatim from the 1611 version of the King James Bible. The song was released in the middle of an unpopular war, Vietnam, and it was kind of a peace anthem. But that's not what the passage really means. If we look at verse 1, there is an appointed time for everything, or depending on your translation, for everything there is a season, and there is a time for every matter under heaven. There being an appointed time for everything implies that there is someone doing the appointing. This appointed time is essentially God's timing, and this is God's work. The things happening in these verses are happening to us, but they're also caused by God, and they're under God's providential control. In Psalm 31:15, David says that his times are in God's hand, meaning that God controls his life and his future, and his destiny is in God's hands. In God's appointed time, he set about an orderly creation. It may not look like it may not feel like it as we're living through it, but we do live in a rich tapestry of contrasting colors that are intricately woven together, where everything is placed just so, calibrated perfectly. Even in the apparent randomness of Hevel, it's not really random. All things have their time, which are appointed by God. But God's time might not be in our lifetimes, right? Since we humans are but a vapor. So that introduces a level of frustration to things. God's timing is perfect, and that means that there is no chance. Fate doesn't appoint things for us, God does. And what God has appointed is unavoidable. So in this orderly creation, we know that life has a rhythm to it. We have a week of time. The weeks repeat themselves. We have months, and the years and the seasons repeat themselves. Verse 1 is what's called a chiasmus, which is a sequence that is repeated and developed, but in reverse order. And in this case, we have A, B, B, A pattern. So for everything, there is a season or a specific time for everything. And now notice what the Kohelet doesn't say about time. He doesn't say that time is short. He doesn't say that we never have enough time to do everything that we want. He doesn't say that time is fleeting and once it's gone, it's gone. He says that under heaven, time is orderly. That under heaven being a reference to all the things that happen on earth, which is a place of vanity, it's a place of folly, it's endless repetition. It's a place where we sweat and we labor to shepherd the wind. The Kohelet gives us this principle in verse 1, and then in verses 2 through 8, he illustrates it with 14 paradoxical statements. These 14 lines are called antinomies. I'll be honest, I had to look that up. The definition of an antinomy is a contradiction between two equally valid or equally reasonable beliefs, conclusions, or principles, or stated another, more simpler way, it's a paradox. It's a contradiction. It's an inconsistency. They're absurdities. It's a puzzle. It's a mystery. Those are some of the synonyms. The origin of the word comes from the Greek. Anti meaning against, nomos meaning law. So it's a conflict or a mutual incompatibility between two laws or two norms. Each of these 14 statements shows a contrast between what we might think of as being a desirable and undesirable. They aren't really desirable and undesirable, but they just are. But that's how our human brains function. These verses flow back and forth. They have different patterns of the desirable events as compared to the undesirable. Now notice that the Kohelet isn't telling us how we can achieve the desirable or how we can avoid the undesirable. That's not the way that God has made the world. You can't have one without the other. The point is that life is filled with both. In these 14 statements, there's this idea of a completeness or a comprehensiveness that for every matter or every activity in life is being represented in these verses. So, for example, there's a time to be born and a time to die, right? And there's all the times in between. There's a time to weep and there's a time to laugh. And there's a full range of emotions that humans all experience as we live this life. Verses 2 and 3 deal with beginning and endings. We have a comparison between the birth and the death, between planting and uprooting, killing and healing, tearing down and building up. Planting and uprooting can be seen as metaphors for the start of life and the death of life. What we see is that everything on earth has a start or a beginning, and all things have an end. Nothing lasts forever. There's a time when we are each born, and there will be a time when we each die. And in between those two events, we have all the moments in between. God gives us the life, and we live until God takes that life away. With the reference to planting, man only is able to plant in specific seasons, right? There's a time for everything. Maybe South Texas isn't a great example, but places where it gets cold for more than 2 weeks out of the year, what happens if you plant crops in the winter? They don't grow, right? Because it's too cold, it freezes, because the shortened day doesn't provide enough sunlight, because there's not enough water. So there's rhythms to life that man has learned to live and be productive in. Verse 3 continues the beginning and ending theme, but now we're dealing with a construction and a destruction. As we look at these verses, we naturally want to be in the desirable category, right? In this case, we want to be on the healing, the building up side of things. And we want to avoid the undesirable. We want to avoid them being done to us. But just as there are times to heal and there are times to build up, there are legitimate times to kill and to tear down. Capital punishment, war, maybe in self-defense to preserve life. The verse isn't talking about murder. The word for kill is kill. But that's, what that implies is there's never an appropriate time to sin. As we think through this, the Kohelet isn't giving us his opinion on the ethical concerns involved in killing versus healing, tearing down versus building up. He's not saying that we should or should not kill. He's simply giving the statement a fact that there are times for both, to kill and to heal. In verse 4, we're told that there is a time to experience the full range of emotions. There is a time to weep, to cry bitterly. There's a time to laugh, and there's a time for every emotion in between. Both sorrow and joy are a part of life. Sorrow leads to mourning, and joy leads to celebration and dancing. We might prefer if we didn't have to experience the events that lead to weeping and mourning, but without those bad events, there would be no way to really appreciate the events that bring the joy and the laughing. So without having experienced the darkness of mourning and crying bitter tears, you could never really appreciate the joy. In the world that God's created, again, you can't have the one without the other. Maybe something to point out here that weeping, that mourning, what we might call depression or being brought low, those are not sins. It's not necessarily a statement on our faith. You understand what I mean by that? Christ wept. Weeping isn't a sin. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are in rebellion against God if we cry, if we are sorrow and down. On the contrary, God has appointed for each of us tears that we will cry. And in that moment, it's the right and appropriate thing to do, to cry. Verse 5 is kind of an obscure reference, and it's debated as to the meaning. Each of the other verses seem to have an obviously related and contrasting set of pairs. Some people think to throw stones is a reference to tearing down buildings and cities, and to gather stones together is a reference to build buildings and cities. Some people believe that verse 5 to be a reference to the clearing of stones in a field in preparation to plant crops or a vineyard. I've read that Israel is a very rocky area, and in order to plant crops, the many rocks in a field must first be cleared. Now, the opposite of this would be to put stones in your enemy's field, preventing them from growing food during periods of war and conflict. And we see this, an example of this in 2 Kings chapter 3, where it says in verse 19, "Then you shall strike every fortified city and every choice city, and fell every good tree, and stop all the springs of water, and mar every good piece of land with stones." And there's a couple of other examples of that throughout 2 Kings as well. Some believe this to be, the throwing of stones to be a reference to a sexual union, especially when paired with the second part of the verse dealing with embracing and withholding an embrace. The stones could be used for shepherds counting sheep, or other forms of commerce or business. Another possibility is that the hand that is used to throw or gather a stone is the hand that also is used to embrace. So the specific meaning isn't really clear, at least from what I could see. Verse 6 deals with possessions and the things that we own. Do our possessions rule our lives? Do we hoard things? Do we refuse to give things up, give up the things that we have? Are we so cheap that we refuse to buy something that we might need? There is a time to acquire new things, and there is a time to stop and not acquire new things. There's a time to keep what we have, and there's a time to give it away. There's a time to throw it away. There's a time to seek in order to find something. And there's a time to stop and give up searching and count that item as lost. And ultimately, no thing in this world is really ours. Verse 7 is another verse that has several possible meanings. Some believe there's a link here to the tearing of the clothes and being silent to experiencing a deep grief. In Job chapter 2, after Job loses his family and his health and all his possessions and his livelihood, we read that Job's 3 friends tore their robes and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. When they sat on the ground with him for 7 days, 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw his pain was very great. Job's friends, in their pain and in their sorrow, they tore their garments, and they became silent as they mourned with their friend. Some commentators believe this verse could be referring to the tearing or the separating of relationships, and likewise the mending or the reconciliation of relationships. This verse could be a reference on knowing the proper time to speak and when to keep silent. For example, in Proverbs chapter 26, verse 4, it says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you yourself also be like him." And then in the immediate next verse, verse 5, it says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." What's the difference in these 2 verses? The timing, right? The wisdom in knowing when to speak and when to keep silent. Verse 8, the last verse of the poem, we're told here that there is a time to love and hate and a time for war and peace. Now, similarly to verse 3, the Kohelet is not giving his opinion on if we should or should not go to war, if we should or should not hate. He's simply saying that there is an appropriate time for war and an appropriate time to hate. And again, similarly as verse 3, war and hate are not necessarily sinful in and of themselves. So are there any questions? Any comments? Anything anybody saw? Want to? No? I must be doing a good job. Yeah, he's wrestling with the idea of, exactly what you're saying. And he gets to the point at the beginning of chapter 4 where it's like, you almost get the impression it's like, it would be better if I just wasn't born, if I hadn't been born than to have gone through all of this. And he wrestles with that idea in the later part of chapter 3 where he's questioning, what happens in this life. It seems it's a repeated theme that he looks at it like, man, the best we can do is just enjoy the small things, the simple things in life, a good meal, your family, your friends, satisfaction in your work. But at the end of the day, is that it? Is there more to that? What happens next? Where's the spirit of man go? And so we'll kind of see some of that as we go through. But that's a good observation. Great.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it also kind of indicates the first couple of chapters talk about how much of life is repetitive.
Yes.
The wind just continues to circle around, rivers constantly flowing to the sea, and the sea's never full. Yet amongst that repetitive part of life, yet there is variety.
Yeah.
And so there are a variety of things that we can experience in this life. And as you said, this is all a gift of God.
right? And so it's the idea that he says it in chapter 1, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. There's nothing new under the sun, right? In the grand scheme of things, from God's perspective, there's nothing new under the sun. From my perspective, your perspective, well, I experience new things all the time, right? But from God's perspective, in the orderly creation that God has made, there are the rhythms, there are the cycles, there are the repetition, and we think we may be experiencing something new and being clever and whatnot, but at the end of the day, from God's perspective, it's like, nah, I've seen that. The weeks, there's a week, the week repeat themselves, and the years repeat themselves, and everything you've done, somebody else has done before you. So yeah. Yes.
Because these things are going to come to us. There's false faith that tells you you don't have to suffer, you rebuke Satan,
Yeah.
you rebuke all. But these things are part of our life.
Yeah.
And we're going to experience them, even in a time to kill us.
Yeah.
Our family can be killed, not
Yeah.
necessarily when we do the killing, but those are seasons in our life. So for me, I feel like it pretty much covers our life. These things, we're going to experience these things.
Yes.
And you said they're not new to us. They're new for us because we've never been through them, but we're not going to be.
Right.
What happens, life happens to everyone, and just like the Bible says, He raised up the just and the unjust. I think so many times people ask questions because for some reason, we feel as Christians, we're covered under the blood, we're covered under certain things, and we're not going to experience these things. But these things are there for us.
Right, and you're exactly right. It made me think of something. There are a lot of, not necessarily cults, right, but different sects or different religions that, prosperity gospel kind of thing that comes to mind, where it's if you just have enough faith, then you won't experience X, Y, and Z, the bad things. It's funny, if you just have enough faith, you can make yourself healthy and you can be healthy, says the guy wearing glasses, right? Well, just make yourself fix, no one sees that contradiction, right? Yeah, we may not go through war, like I may never have to go through a war, but there's been countless wars. There will be more wars that everybody goes through, and the rain falls on the just and the unjust. Everyone goes through this life that God has created, and that's the struggle that the Koheleth's dealing with, right? Is like, wasn't it better to be wise? Isn't it better to do good? Isn't it better to fear God? And then on the other side of that, he's like, yes, I can see there's truth to that. Yes, those things are true. But on the other side of this, I see that wicked dude prospering, man, and I don't get it. What's going on with that? And so that's the struggle that he's wrestling with in his mind. And we kind of have the perspective of watching him struggle, right? And I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we've all struggled in similar ways. And that's not necessarily, I don't see it as being something sinful, right? It's like you're wrestling with, God, I know you're good. But why did I lose my first son, right? Like, why is this terrible thing happening? Why is fill in the blank, right? All the tragedies that every one of us goes through, and we will go through at some point in our lives. Yeah.
So he's building this up right now just to say that these are all equalizers, right? Everyone experiences these sorts of things. So the argument, for example, that one of Job's friends tells him, it's like, well, you must have done something wrong to deserve this to happen.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that argument obviously gets thrown out the window towards the end of Job. And here, he hasn't made that argument yet, but it seems to suggest that, as to your point, right, like if you're saying that this happens to believers and unbelievers, it's like, well, then it's not really a matter of like what prosperity gospel teaches, like, well, there's a specific formula or a specific transaction that has to happen between the human and the divine for that to be passed on to receive blessing, right?
Yeah.
And then the same thing happened with Roman and Greek culture, right? If you sacrifice to a specific god,
It's
you
not
receive blessing.
it's not a checklist.
Exactly. Yeah.
If I can do, I'm good. We might get that impression if we look at just Proverbs by itself, right? But, we look at Scripture in light of all of Scripture, right? How do we compare this with the totality of Scripture? And how does this truth make sense in the larger truth and fitting those pieces together? And that's why he's telling us sometimes it feels like it's a paradox, like I'm limited and I don't have the full wisdom that I wish I had, and I just can't see it. Those are good points. So the Kohelet is telling us in this poem that in God's timing, that he's in control of all things and all circumstances, essentially that he is sovereign. And in his decree, he has decreed all of life's events to happen to each of us, and we have to live through them. So in light of God's orchestration, what's the Kohelet's response? Well, that comes in verses 9 through 15. Was I on the wrong thing the whole time? Okay. What advantage is there to the worker from that in which he labors? I have seen the endeavor which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to be glad and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks and sees good in his labor, it is a gift of God. I know that everything God does will be forever. There's nothing to add to it. There's nothing to take from it. God has worked it so that men should fear him. That which is has been already, and that which will be has already been, yet God seeks that is pursued. Verse 9, the Kohelet initiates this next section by asking what I think is a rhetorical question. He basically says, what do we get from working so hard? The labors, the toils that he's talking about are all of life's activities from verses 2 through 8. What advantage do we get from working so hard in our life? And the answer is that, there's not much advantage. All our hard work is ultimately negated by Hevel. Our works don't last. We pass away. Our works pass away with us or shortly after us. Verse 10, the Kohelet then tells us that he has seen the heavy load and the burdens that God has given or afflicted men with their time on earth. And he's repeating this idea from chapter 1, verse 13, and I gave my heart to seek and to explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. He's studying everything, and it is grievous or evil. It is a grievous or evil endeavor with which God has given to the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He's repeating himself, right? He's saying that I've spent all my time in study, all my considerable wisdom to find the truth of this matter. And man, God has really put a heavy load on people. Later in chapter 2, verse 11, the Kohelet says that all his labor and his toil and his works turned out to be Hevel. And there's this repetition here with the idea of the futility or the difficulty of work. And we can insert ourselves at this point in the text and know that no doubt the difficulty that we find ourselves in is a direct result of sin and the fall. In Genesis 3, after the sin has entered into the world, God tells Adam, the ground will be cursed because of him. All the days of his life, through pain, through thorns and toil and sweat, only then will he eat. And so even though the world is this well-ordered place, he's essentially getting to what I think is this world a place of joy. And overall, you get the impression that, not really. There's a drudgery to life. Even so, in verse 11, the Kohelet states that he, referring to God, has made everything beautiful in its time. God has appointed everything beautiful or appropriate, depending on your translation, in its time or in his time. And this reiterates verses 1 through 8, and it confirms that God has a plan for all things. And in that plan, a perfect timing exists. And in that perfect timing, God brings about all things that he is determined to happen. One translation describes this word as fitting beautifully together. And it's the same word used throughout Genesis chapter 1 in the creation narrative, where God makes the world and everything in it out of nothing, and then he pauses and he looks at his creation and he sees that everything was made good. And there's an elegance to the world and the flow of time. But the problem is that we are finite creatures, right? And God is not finite. He's not a creature. And the finite always leaves very frustrated when we intersect with God's infinity, because we just cannot comprehend the magnitude of God and his ways. The Kohelet then states, God has set eternity in man's heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. God has placed eternity in man's heart so that he knows deep inside himself that there's something more. There's something beyond us, beyond this world and our presence in it. that there is more to this life, and nothing under the sun can really and completely satisfy our hearts. God has made man curious, eternally curious. Man wants to know God's plans. He wants to know what God has done. He wants to understand God and what he's doing now. But we're stopped short, this verse says. The wording can be taken as either God has placed limitations upon man's capacity to comprehend, or he has also placed an ignorance or a darkness in our hearts so that we see things dimly or darkly. So we have this sense of things, but not a complete picture. We are capable of asking really, really deep questions, hard questions about life and the situations we find ourselves in, but we don't have the ability to answer those questions. For example, why would a truly good God ever decree and ordain evil? How could a truly perfect man, Adam, before the fall, ever fall into sin? How can God be sovereign over sin and at the same time man be responsible for sin? Those three questions are John Murray's three unsolvable problems of the fall. Now, Joseph were here, I'm sure he could solve them, but alas, he's not. So try as we might, we were never really going to get a satisfactory answer to all of life's enigmas. So on first appearance, it seems that as though God has done something good and marvelous, and he has, right? He's put eternity into our hearts. But the Kohelet says that in the end, it just leads to frustration. Because even though the things that God has appointed and made beautiful and appropriate, don't really seem beautiful to us because we can't comprehend God, his timing of things, and all the difficulties of life because of Hevel. And even though God is in control, we are not. And that leaves us frustrated because we don't understand the Hevel and the orderly creation that God has made. So based on this, the Kohelet asserts from all his studies, from all his observations, two things. He says in verses 12 and 13, I know the best that we can do is to be glad and do good, to enjoy good food, to get satisfaction in your work and the fruit of your labors. He's expressing this idea numerous times throughout the book that the simple pleasures are the best that we can hope for. But here he goes one step further. He says that if you do find pleasure and happiness in these simple things, then you have been blessed, because not everybody gets to enjoy these things in their life. This pleasure, if we do find it, is a gift that comes only from God. So in the middle of Hevel, we see that God can and does give us gifts, and we can have enjoyment in our lives. And this is, again, the best that man can have in this life. The second thing that the Kohelet asserts in verse 14, he says, I know that everything God does will last forever, unlike man's activities that pass away, because what God has done can't be undone by you, me, or anybody. What God has done is perfect. There's nothing that we can add to it or take from it to make it better. What we find is that ultimately man is utterly dependent on God, and he has done this so that we would be in awe of him. So the Kohelet's advice seems to be to accept that God has ordained all things, accept it, that he has appointed everything in its time, that every event that you will go through, accept it and stop trying to figure everything out. Stop trying to figure God out. You can't. You can't control your life. And if we can do these things and accept it as it is, as God has made it, then even the hard parts become bearable. Verse 15 is kind of a transition verse. It says, that which has been already and that which will be has already been, kind of a weird phrasing. But this is a rephrasing of chapter 1, verse 9. And it essentially says there's nothing new under the sun. And that is thanks to God and the way that he runs the world. The last part of verse 15 says, yet God seeks what is pursued. It's kind of a difficult verse, but various translations that I looked at are really kind of all over the place. But from what I've seen, there are one of two things being communicated here. First, there's nothing new under the sun. And what is happening now has already happened before. The things that will happen in the future have already happened to someplace else because God has made the same things to happen over and over again through the rhythms and the cycles that he has created. If this is the case, then the text would fit with the previous section dealing with God appointing a time for everything in life. Second, Since there is injustice in the world, there's nothing new under the sun. God seeks after those who have been persecuted, driven away, or passed by, depending on your translation, and he will judge those who are doing the persecution and the injustice and bring those people to justice, to hold the pursuers accountable. And if this is the case, then this text kind of fits in with the last section in the chapter. I'm running out of time, so I'll move kind of quick. Verses 16 through 22, the Kohelet deals with the idea of justice and injustice. And here's another observation that supports the idea that everything is Hevel. He says that he has observed that in the place of justice and righteousness, there is instead wickedness. The king, the judges, the courts of law, those people, those places should be places of honor and should uphold justice. But instead, what we find is that throughout time and history, over and over again, that those who should give people justice and uphold God's law often do not. We as a people, we want justice. We expect justice. And we get angry when unjust things happen to us. Even in our court system, the very people who are charged to bring justice are the ones who pervert it. And injustice reigns, and it spoils everything. And there isn't anything that man can do to change those injustices. Innocence and guilt are confused. The innocent are judged guilty, and the guilty are judged innocent. It's wickedness. And then the Kohelet says in verse 17 that God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man, to your point. Both for a time has been, a time for every matter and for every work is there. Like everything else in life, God who controls the times has appointed a time for judgment, and everyone will be judged. But like the poem on time, where everything has its appointed time, man doesn't know the times or understand God's timing, and we're left frustrated with all this injustice that we find. Now, the Kohelet isn't talking about the judgment that we know that comes from life after death, right? What he is saying is, how can life have meaning when there's just so much injustice in it? People get what they don't deserve. How is God going to bring this judgment? When will it happen? He doesn't deny that God is just. He doesn't see any evidence for it, and he's trying to figure it out. That even if God is just, and it certainly doesn't appear that way from where I'm standing. And the implication is, well, that's what really matters, what I perceive, right? What I think and what I feel. Perception is reality kind of thing. And the Kohelet comes up with, what the Kohelet comes up with is that God is testing man. In verse 18, he says, I said in my heart concerning the sons of men that God is testing them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same fate for each of them. As one dies, so dies the other. And they have all the same breath. So there is no advantage for man over beasts, for all is Hevel. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Because of all the injustices man does, man is no better than the beasts and the animals of the field. We live like dogs, we'll die like dogs, essentially is what he's saying. Now, what these verses are communicating is that both man and beast are under God's appointed timing. Both man and beast live because of the breath or the life that God gives them. Both man and beast are subject to God's authority, and they share the same fate. They're going to ultimately one day die, and they'll return to the dust. It's Hevel. And here, the Kohelet ponders what happens after we die. He says in verse 21, who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? In this verse, the breath most likely refers to spirit, as opposed to verse 19, where the breath most likely refers to life, the life force. Who knows if the spirit of man ascends up, presumably to the presence of God, while the spirit of the animal goes into the ground, or it fades away, or who knows? The Kohelet does recognize that the body and the spirit are separate and distinct from each other. He knows that the bodies of both man and animals goes to the same place. They go to the ground. But what happens next? Where do the spirits go? The Kohelet is a man of study. He's observed all these matters of life, but he can't observe this. From his perspective, it's impossible to know what happens after death. And as we read this section, we get the idea, we hope, right, that the Kohelet is going to give us some sort of a solution, that he's going to answer these questions. He doesn't. We don't get to find out. Instead, the Kohelet ends this section with a kind of resignation as he asks another rhetorical question. How can man see what happens after he's gone? In this reality of death, who really knows what happens next? The expected answer is that no one really knows. When we're gone from this life, we're gone. And he returns to the idea that the best that we can hope for in our present circumstances is to be glad in our works, for that is our portion. Find satisfaction in what you do. Enjoy the life that you have as you have it. And if we keep going into chapter 4, his reflection is essentially like, man, like I said earlier, it would have been better that I had never been born. So, like Joseph said in week 1, this is kind of a, it's a challenging book to go through. We want happy endings. All our movies have happy endings, but we're not getting that as we go through this chunk by chunk. So, like Joseph said, essentially we'll have to stay tuned for the final chapter of the book. Are there any questions, any comments as we close? I appreciate the discussion. That was good. Let's close in prayer. Father, I pray that you would cause your people to live and enjoy the lives that you have given us, that we would enjoy the pleasures you've provided in this life. And we pray, Lord, that in the hevel that we find ourselves in, that you would cause us to remember that you are good, that you are loving, you are all powerful, that not a hair can fall from our heads without your sovereign decree. Lord, help us to remember these truths. In Christ's name, amen.